Hello and welcome to the Learning Future podcast. I'm your host, Luca Parry, and it's my delight today to be speaking with Melodie Potts. She is founder and CEO of Teach for Australia and is a disruptor and a problem solver driven by a vision for Australia where education gives every child, regardless of their background, greater choice for their future. Melodie has made it her mission to champion better educational outcomes for the most vulnerable children in Australia. And over the past 12 years, the work of TFA has helped more than 350,000 students in 220 schools and has built a community of 1,200 plus teachers and leaders who are bringing about change inside and outside of the classroom. Melodie is well awarded in many regards. She was awarded the Order of Australia for her service to education and teacher development in 2021, holds a Master of Public Policy from Harvard and a Bachelor of Economics from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's originally from a beautiful part of the world in rural Appalachia and now lives in Melbourne with her husband Sam and their young son Harrison, affectionately dubbed Harry the Hurricane. I'm sure particularly in lockdowns, that's also been the case. And their lovely dog, Jack the Ripper Russell. Melodie, thank you for making the time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me, Luca.
I would love you, and there's so many things that are happening in our world right now. What is one thing that you reflect upon that you've learned?
I've learned how to be a good enough CEO, mother, wife, homeschool, parent, teacher, combo, and a not good enough dog trainer. But something that I've also learned, this is just funny, it just happened just the other day, in all the randomness that is home learning these days. You can only fold a piece of A4 paper and possibly other things. I've tried it with sheets as well. You can only fold a piece of paper about 6 or 7 times and then no more. I've tried it with different sizes of pieces of paper. I started with A4, but this is what your children can also teach you.
That is fantastic. And
try it. You know you're going to try it now, right?
Of course I'm going to try it. And of course, the underlying principle of that is the exponential. You know, that every time you do one more fold, you're actually doubling all the folds that have taken place before. Which, and we're all familiar with exponential, sadly, now because of, dare I say it, COVID and, straightening the curve and flattening the curve and all the other things we're trying to do to this curve. It's wonderful, though, to reflect on the different roles that you play. Because, you are an educator and a leader, and you're also a human being. And of course, all of us are. And really the work that you've been focused on seems to me to be trying to really do something about equity in our country and in the world. Take us into, in any direction that you choose, what has been one of the big ideas that you've been trying to explore, over the past decade or so?
Well, over the past decade, I think the big idea is, of all the drivers of educational inequity, you can go to the super macro systemic, power structures, all the way through to, something that is always a lovely hot topic about what is taught and how it's taught. That inherent in all of those things are people. And, there are great people already in our schools, in all sorts of different roles in our schools, helping to teach the next generation. But what if there were more? And what if we could really both bring in the additional talent that we want and direct it to where it's needed, and then work with the talent that's there to build more rapidly the kind of skills and mindsets that they ultimately need in order to unlock learning for young people, and recognizing that all again happens within a system the way that we normally think of it, with bureaucracies and departments and rules and regulations and whatnot. But really, how do we ultimately catalyze leadership throughout the system? Off the back of what we're building early on in their experience in it. So it's kind of, how can the adults make it okay and make the kids all right? That's sort of the interesting kind of tension and also challenge that we've set for ourselves. And more recently, all things, leading to the current pandemic and questions about what it's all going to mean once it all kind of settles into whatever the future holds. And none of us really know yet. I think asking what is the role of teaching and leading now, and how will it shift, and will the shift that it might become the role of the teacher, and what is learning, and what is the purpose of schooling, all those big meta questions. But how will that potentially shift more rapidly than we were planning for it to, or that anyone thought might even be possible? Those are the sorts of things now that are keeping me a bit occupied, and not unrelated to the fact I lead an organization, so also just the future of work, how work is done, where work is done. Those are day-to-day challenges right now as a leader of an organization. But in terms of the big macro, why we exist, are we going to be able to continue to, is teaching becoming more or less attractive through this work, through this current time, through the current pressures? Are we rethinking the role of education in the current time, given the current pressures? Is it helping to create more coherence and consensus about that, or is it actually driving a wedge further apart? I don't know,
Just
but that's what I'm thinking about.
Like coffee questions for us to dive into. Thanks, Melodie. But all these questions is really what we've been trying to explore as well through this podcast as well. And Dr. Karen Edge from UCL recently on a podcast really spoke about she's a researcher around generational leadership. And, you've got millennials now coming to the wet, and soon we're going to have, we've got, the generational
What's after
shifts.
millennials? I feel like we're already there.
I think we're there. Next? Yeah, I know. I'm holding on to that. It's just, people's preferences for work are different. And yet one of the things is that, the teaching profession itself, with the incredible impact that educators make every single day around the world, is also quite rigid. Like we haven't seen a real shift. Whereas, notwithstanding the fact that in 24 hours, many teachers had to put their entire curriculum online. Some parts of the world, 1.5 billion learners learning remotely, at the peak of the pandemic. I mean, these are pretty significant changes and accelerants. So I'm really interested in, in particular your perspective on talent, because, and most people listening to our conversation will know about Teach for Australia or Teach for America or Teach for All network in their respective country. Sure. But I'd love you to share a little bit more about the model and why is it interesting?
I mean,
part of the ecosystem.
In a way, the model that we have, and some of the questions that we have about where it might go next, in a way, it's quite simple. We're out there saying, here's an opportunity for you to do something that you've probably already thought somewhere in your heart of hearts you might be interested in doing. And that is trying your hand at teaching and giving something of yourself to the next generation. And so why don't you think about doing that? And really what we've done, which isn't rocket science, is tried to remove, without lowering the qualification expectations or the quality in any way, we've tried to remove some of the barriers to people being able to make that choice. And for us, who gets the privilege to stand in front of our young people, particularly some of our most vulnerable young people, is something we should care a lot about. And so we get the opportunity to have lots of conversations with people about what their motivations and desires are, and whether the schools and the children with whom we work would be the right place for them. And then we get to construct a way for them to start to teach and start their journey of becoming a teacher concurrently, in an employment-based model that lowers the opportunity cost for them to make the switch. And through that, what we're also building is a community of people that they belong to, that also, they're very diverse, but they're all kind of motivated by the same question of, how can I bring my full self to facilitating the learning and the ultimate kind of full realization of others, of young people. And how can I do that in a way that increases equity and choice that these children will have in their lives, because it's not a function of who they are, but a function of their circumstance. So that's really the kind of glue that binds this mission, this esprit de corps, but the model itself is actually quite simple. You come in, you do some initial learning. It's about 20% of a master's degree, and then you spend the next 2 years in an employment within a school that we've helped to broker. So we've got partnerships with schools, partnerships with obviously candidates, and placing into vacancies. And then we build that community around them. That's a huge component of support. We also support them in other ways. We have teachers who go out and observe. We invest in the mentors within the schools to upskill the mentors, and that's a gift that keeps on giving. Any other novice teacher that comes in, gets the same sort of benefit from upskilling the in-school mentors. And over time, what we hope to build is a community of our alumni who stay on in the classroom, and the majority of them do. I think the current stats from our survey this year is 70% of them are still teaching. Another 18% are still active in what we would consider mission relevant work. So they're either in departments of education, or they're in education nonprofits, or they're at the Grattan or wherever, trying to help kind of shape the system of the future. And so that's a pretty good retention rate, 88% overall in teaching, or in education, 70% overall in teaching, the majority of those in still low income, rural, regional, and remote contexts where they were placed. And that community of alumni at the back end is also part of what we're trying to ultimately gift into the system.
Yeah.
And then where we take this next, that model works. It's been going now for, I think we've just closed applications for our 13th cohort.
Congratulations.
But where we go with it next, other ways that we can make it flex to the needs of schools and to increasingly diverse cohorts, and other ways that we can think about some of the other capabilities we've built to work with even more teachers. Those are some of the exciting questions that we're grappling with now.
Wow. Oh, so many potential directions. I want to take us into the role of teacher conversation, which is a kind of meta concept as well, because, one of the great questions that we always reflect, is a great interview question is, how do you think learning happens? It's a great question because it reveals a bias to us as educators, and are we do we have a more transactional view? Do we have more of a learning architect view? Are we a constructionist? Whatever the case might be.
Yeah.
I think deeply about the role of teachers, and if it's even feasible in this modern world of rapid, accelerating, converging technologies, driven by Moore's law and the VUCA world, all these conceptions. Like how might the role of an educator? Clearly, we need to continue to raise the status of it, in Australia in particular. The just a teacher comment needs to be removed forever from the vocabulary of Australians.
Agreed.
What's your current, deep inquiry about how the role of a teacher shifts? Because this kind of transactional, even kind of the directive role, which is still critical, it becomes increasingly impossible in a world of unlimited information. How do you see that shift taking place?
I mean, I don't know if this is the right answer. This is just how my brain works. And I don't know if anyone's got the ultimate answer, but
yeah, that's right.
I love the word and maybe, I'll just say this, and then if we want to come back to it, we can leave it. I think one of the things that I find just so maddening in education is the kind of contest of ideas that quickly becomes a contest of ideology that then makes it all or rather than and.
Yes.
So how I think about the role of a teacher is kind of that it is a number of things concurrently. At the end of the day, I think it's a relationship. I really do believe that, first and foremost. My life, my ability to, have done what I've done and to have, achieved whatever I've achieved and to be able to have chosen to live my life on a completely different continent than that which I was born, is because I had a number of great educators, but a few with whom the relationship made me see something in myself that I maybe didn't think was possible, or helped me maintain motivation when I felt like giving up.
Yeah.
And it was at a critical juncture. So, people who come into your life at that critical moment, and for me, obviously loving family, lots of other protective factors, but the power of a teacher and in the relationship and the trust and the seeing, I see you,
Yeah.
you, not your grade, you, I think is paramount and first and foremost. And not every teacher needs to be that for every child, but you need enough teachers
Yeah.
so that most every child gets an opportunity to at least have that once, right? So I think teaching and the future of teaching will always be relational. And if ever it isn't, we I don't know what that says about us as a society, because it's always been us.
Yeah.
And as humans, we're social beings. And I think lockdown and isolation and everything has proven just how much that is true to our healthy functioning. I think that teaching is also about information. And I think your question about the fact that there is lots of information and that it could be at your fingertips, readily available, is true. But I think it's about making sense of that information and being able to scaffold and build, content on itself.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's lots of opportunity. It's the Wild West of ed tech right now. I mean,
Definitely
whoa.
true. Yeah.
But I think the role of a teacher, as still having a role to facilitate learning of content, is not something you want to see replaced. But it can certainly be augmented very, very well, and actually can start to gift to teachers time.
Yeah.
Time. That's the power of ed tech in my mind. Like, can we gift teachers time back? And I think that's going to probably cause some interesting conversations amongst certain populations of teachers about how time is currently spent, and are you willing to kind of give over to some sort of LMS type of world with differently curated, more global kind of content, a little bit of the initial instruction, so that you can then go deeper. That's it. So I think teaching is still information/content. And helping to make sense of that so that you can build. And then I think the final thing that teaching in the future will be is, and this is a challenge because there's always these conversations about the different roles that exist within schools as they currently exist. You've got your careers advisor, you've got well-being, you've got all these other roles, but I do think it's almost a little bit of a guide, helping kids start to really grapple with what they value and what they want their life to mean, and where they could go next. And it doesn't mean that the teacher is responsible for the future choices that a child and a young person might take. But I do think that if you can give them the time to ignite the passion of the content, if you can build the relationship, then kind of the inevitable thing that flows from that is that they're a bit of a guide for young people about where they could go and who they could be in the future. And that's a really awesome thing.
Oh, Melodie, it's actually this is quite an emotional thing to reflect upon in some ways. When we think about the people in our lives that have actually shaped us or inspired us or shifted us, our family members, our educators, our teachers, isn't it a tragedy when we have young people that can't point to those people for them?
Yes.
I think, as you've just said so powerfully, it's not that every teacher needs to be that for every child, but that every young person deserves, those people who believe in them, that see them, was the word that you used, and see them fully and wholly for who they are, not just for their achievement or not just for a particular role. And so, where you started, the idea of people being kind of the central part of education. And that's why it's just so fascinating and rewarding to work in it, because it's a human system.
Yeah.
And it's also the most difficult thing about it is that it's It's human beings the whole time. It's not a spreadsheet, it's
Yeah.
actually dynamic
I
and
kind of
emergent.
I kind
Yeah.
of joke sometimes, that teaching and I always think of teaching as an act of leadership, and so teaching and leading,
Yes.
both which are kind of in an educational context, that it's rocket science. And in a way, it's not, because if you think about rocket science, and I'm not an engineer, so all the rocket scientists out there, I apologize for butchering your very hard-won knowledge. But it's kind of technical, right?
Yes.
Like in other words, there's rules, and if you follow the rules of physics, then you can kind of solve for it if you're clever enough. But the degree of executive functioning, the just constantly nuanced decisions, that you're taking almost on autopilot, if you're a really great teacher, and if you're thinking about the relationship, the content, the learning objectives, and when you get the moment, the kind of opportunity and future that you're helping to make possible for young people, like that's a lot to hold.
Yeah.
And so we joke that teaching is rocket science, because of just the fact that we like to think that rockets are complex, and they
Yeah,
are.
I love that, Melody. My favorite reflection on this is that teaching isn't rocket science. It's far more
Oh,
difficult than that.
good point. Yeah,
It's
fair
far more
enough.
difficult, actually,
I think we're
because
saying the same thing.
we
Yeah.
are absolutely. And I want to pick up your earlier point around the contestation of ideas and how we kind of end up in these ideological battlegrounds between synthetic phonics and whole language, or between curriculum reform and another review. What, in your experience and from your perspective, is the opportunity that we have to go beyond, to get to this or to this both and world? It really does seem like it needs to be some kind of transcendence or some depth around a universal principle of human growth and development. And the one thing I want to put in the space too is I'd love your view on what the framing for that could be for us in education, because it does seem, from my vantage point, an opportunity with the field of social emotional development, or soft skills, the future of work, and well-being and learning or achievement. There seems this convergent happening from, fields like the affective neurosciences, for example, as well, that are saying actually, yeah, emotion and cognition are really totally interwoven.
Mm-hmm.
Let's put them back together.
Mm-hmm.
This is a deep question, but what do you
Yeah,
think?
and you possibly know more about it than I do. I mean, the thing that I just keep coming back to, and I had a colleague actually who shared a beautiful story, which I'll share on and try not to butcher. The thing that I keep coming back to is just what serves the kids. Just what serves the kids,
Yeah.
And so the science of learning serves kids. So does inquiry. And so I think it's rather than trying to have these arguments about exactly what should be given primacy and nothing other than that.
Yeah.
I think there's something, I don't know if that is a unifying question or kind of principle or not, but if we know that phonics, for example, can really, really help kids and universally help most kids, then let's do it. And then let's introduce rich novels.
Exactly.
Do they really have to be either or? Like,
Yeah.
honestly, does that sound? I'm a parent. I want my kid to know phonics because it helps him spell and it helps him,
Decode.
have
Yeah.
pride in being able to decode and start to read. I mean, anyway, early on, when he finally got the hang of it through phonics, just the pride that he had was like was heart-wrenching. I'm getting emotional just thinking about it. But does he need to also be able to discern what a word means when it's in context, and he can decode it, but he doesn't know what it means? And so of course he does. He needs to be able to create meaning out of context. All these things are important. So let's teach teachers how to do them all.
Yeah.
Right? Let's make sure they all got the right skills so that they can serve all the kids. It's just that simple. Like I think we like to make And I know, I mean, if maybe if I was more rooted in a particular philosophy, then maybe I'd want to argue my point from my little corner of the ring a bit more forcefully. But I just am such a pragmatist. Like in all things, moderation. If the science tells you, if the science is saying the relationship, the emotion, the emotional regulation, and the learning, the cognition all go together, well, let's take that and let's do both. It's not beyond us.
What is the?
Am I wrong? I
No,
don't
of
know.
course you're not wrong. And I mean, I put that example there because I think it's a great example of a false
Yeah.
dichotomy.
Yeah.
And it has to be this encompassing, like systematic, complete whole approach that has all of the component parts within it. Otherwise, we are not serving the interests of young people as powerfully as we could.
I think, but this question of, we've just redone our values within Teach for Australia, and the core value that we have is serve the students, and we have other values that hang off of those that that kind of sit around it, but that's at the core. And a colleague of mine was telling me about the Maasai in Kenya who are known historically for being very fierce warriors. And part of the greeting that they give, they have a series of things that they say when they meet each other. And one of the questions that's part of this kind of routinized cultural way of greeting is, and I'm not going to say the words because I'm not going to say it appropriately or properly, but it's, are the children well? Are all the children well? How are the kids?
Yeah.
And I just, like I love the story, and the kind of meaning that would sit within that about the importance that a society is placing on its young people.
Yeah.
That's part of, hi Luca, how's it going?
Yeah.
And are the children well?
Yeah. It's so, gosh, Melly, that's really profound. And I really think the questions that we ask ourselves are what reveal our value sets in societies, in schools, in classrooms. And, I know it's a bit of a cliche now, but really it's are we asking the best questions possible rather than what's the simplest answer? I mean, again, a false dichotomy. Both of those things are great, but I feel that we just still have not yet got the balance right with focusing on deep questions. I mean, that question means that there's a success metric, there's an incentive for that society to keep the children well. And I mean, I'd love your reflection on this. The more time that I spend in education, the more drawn into other domains I am, places like economics and ecology. And because again, everything is just interrelated in some powerful way. And I feel like the influence of the kind of the economic models on our education systems is so pervasive that it feels like we need to do multiple things at the same time. We need to shift beyond the current incentives that exist around success, for example. Earlier this year, we had two very successful traditional model billionaires go to space. I love space. Space is fascinating. And yet, if there were, another species were to come and visit us and they'd look at the way that we are distributing, the way that we are, what we are focusing on, they might ask the same question, like, well, are the children well? Well, no, they're not, but check out my rocket, So I'd love, because you've got a public policy background as well as an education, insight. So what do you, and you spend a lot of time in this economic world. I'd love your insights as someone that's better read than I on the intersection between these two worlds, because I feel like it becomes a narrative that drives our work in education, which is success is achievement only. And I'm pro achievement, but I feel that it cleaves away so much of our human experience because we narrow and we don't see learners as who they truly are anymore. We just see something that they create. And that's it's too often within a narrow frame.
Yeah. I mean, I I feel like the questions that you're grappling with, and the fact that it takes you into sociology, anthropology, it takes you into ecology, and clearly into economics, and the economics kind of came out of philosophy, actually, if I remember my studies back in the day, and it's only, I think, modern policy, because governments, which are built off of social contract with
Yeah.
the human population that they serve. Most governments, clearly not in Afghanistan, but most governments in the world, democratic governments, there's a sort of underlying kind of social contract, and therefore the sort of things that they put in place have a set of values premises around what is an individual entitled to or protected from, and then what is the rest of society sort of owed, and then how do the resources that government ultimately gets, usually through a tax base, how do those get distributed? And almost always the prevailing principle for those choices is for things in social policy, right? Health and education, policing, etc. Those sorts of things are almost always on a kind of utilitarian basis, right? And there's a lot. There's both a philosophical underpinning for that and a lot of conjecture as to exactly how you weight people's happiness. And so what's helpful about those models is that it at least allows you to try and size and scale. I mean, when you're talking about scaled stuff, right, it helps you to try and kind of make at scale decisions and allocations. But then inevitably, things that are big don't suit everyone the same. And so this is one of those things where, I know you're involved in the question of like, well, what's the future of ATAR, and what's the future of how we measure success for young people at the end of their years of schooling? Do we even keep the same number of years of schooling? I mean, you can keep peeling that onion with all sorts of questions.
Back to first principles,
Yeah. And I think the reality is, like, we do need a system that allows different models for different learners, for different preferences, for different flourishing. But we also need to balance that with a system that enables scale, because public education in its universal kind of provision needs to ultimately provide. And so we've got this kind of competing tensions and balances. And at the end of the day, the money's got to go around somehow. And so, I mean, I find the premise of your question, how do I think about it? What are the policy considerations? It really does come back to, well, what's the social contract that we've built with governments predominantly, whether it's a public school or a still government-funded non-government school. What have we said is the expectation that we have of what schooling is ultimately going to deliver? And I think that the current moment provides us a real opportunity to re-ask that question of ourselves. And I don't think, again, it's going to be an or, it's going to be an and. We're still going to want achievement as a proxy for my child learning the things that are going to help them build choices in their future. But I'm also going to want education to, as my child's school does, help them also think about mindfulness and connecting inwardly. What we have to then accept, if we're going to say it's and, is the balance of values that we're then asking a school to help build in our children that's maybe a bit beyond what we've historically thought the role of school was. We'll then have to resource it a bit differently, and we'll have to allow a different level of choice for parents, because the more you get into the other bits of a child, of who they are, not just what they know,
Yes.
then it's a different contract between the family and the value system that the family has and the value system of the school. And so, but I think it's a perfect time to stop and say, well, what is the purpose of education right now? Given that all of us are getting a lens into it in some way, that's probably different than how we had it before.
Yeah, that was a beautifully thought out response, Melodie, I have to say. And of course, finished with a question, which is, what is school for? And there is something about this moment where parents are closer to the learning process in many parts of the world than they've ever been before, because they're actually witnessing it and supporting it in different ways. And, there's lots of hypotheses about what that could mean. I would love you to close us out with, what's a take-home message from our conversation that's kind of ranged from what's the role of a teacher, like what's the future of teaching potentially, what about the intersection about, the philosophy of what schools are for, as we're all trying to work in this kind of ecosystem that really enables human flourishing, or whatever language we want to use around that, depending on our particular preference. What's your take-home message for us all?
Yeah. So I think I have three. The first is, if you're steeped in the world of education, then do your best to look for the and, whatever kind of position you might be coming into the conversation from. Like look for the and. There's some beauty in that. And if you're not steeped in the world of education, don't be hoodwinked by headlines. To try and make it a little bit of a side passion project to start learning about differences of opinions. And then I think what you're going to start to see is that actually there's a lot of truth in all of it. My second thing would be, how beautiful would it be if this, Maasai, and I'm sure there are other examples, Congress examples in other cultures, but this idea of, are the children well, being kind of at the core of what we value as a society, and even how we start to think about engaging and saying hello. I think of our commitment to reconciliation as Australians, and the kind of protocol, the diplomatic protocol that is, acknowledging the lands where we are, and the tradition and the culture that's been here for a long, long time. What if we then extended that one step further, as I know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures do, to then say, are the kids well? And then the third thing would be, just because I'm self-interested and I can't help myself, the opportunity to come and either work or get into teaching through TFA. We're always interested in talking to folks. We see this as a collective effort. I mentioned our values earlier. The core value is serve the kids. The next value is have high expectations of what should be possible for them. The third value is make it happen. The fourth value is get there together, because we can't and won't do this work alone. So the invitation to any listener to make contact, because we don't want to be doing this work alone. We know we're not doing this work alone. And then our fifth value, just to end on it, is to celebrate along the way. And the work of trying to ensure that all children, regardless of background, can have an education that gives them choice and opportunity in their life, is collective work, and it's hard work, and it's not going to happen overnight. And so everyone, no matter what you're doing out there, just needs to find some opportunities to take little wins as they come, and celebrate along the way.
Wow. Melodie, thank you so much for the work you do and for sharing some of it with us today.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you, Luca.